Sometimes I think just be yourself is the most misleading advice we give each other. It sounds simple, almost effortless, as if all you have to do is ignore everyone's opinions and suddenly you are free. But when you actually try to live that way, in real life, on a random Tuesday morning, you realize it's not that straightforward. Because most of us didn't grow up in a vacuum. We grew up absorbing expectations, who we should become, what success looks like, what kind of personality is acceptable, what kind of life is good. And little by little, we adjusted. We learned how to behave, how to answer questions about our future, how to present ourselves in a way that made sense to others. And none of that is necessarily wrong. It's part of growing up. But somewhere in the process, it's easy to lose touch with something quieter. The part of you that isn't trying to perform. I've had moments when these realizations appeared without any drama. Just a simple question, drifting through my mind while making breakfast or walking alone. Does this actually feel like my life? Not whether it looks fine from the outside. Not whether it would be approved of. Just whether it feels like mine. And that question doesn't shout. It doesn't demand an answer immediately. It just lingers in the background. And if you don't slow down, you can miss it entirely. For a long time I thought choosing a life that feels like yours would require some huge decisions. A bold move, a dramatic shift. But the more I pay attention, the more I see that it's rarely about one defining moment. It's about returning to yourself in small ways. It might mean not applying for something just because it sounds impressive, or noticing that a path you are on doesn't actually energize you, even if it seems reasonable. I remember going through periods when I was considering options that looked perfectly acceptable on paper, structured, predictable, sensible. And yet, when I imagined myself years ahead on that same path, something inside me felt tired before it even began. That feeling was subtle, but it was honest. It showed me that if I kept moving automatically, I might end up building a future for a version of myself that didn't really exist. At the same time, there have been phases when life felt surprisingly aligned. Nothing dramatic changed externally, but internally there was a quiet sense of rightness, like my days were finally matching my own rhythm instead of someone else's timeline. That's something I've learned to value, that quiet alignment. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't always look ambitious, but it feels steady. There's another part of this process that I think we misunderstand completely. We often think growth means adding more to ourselves. More goals, more routines, more self-improvement strategies, more achievements. And sometimes that kind of expansion helps. But if you are not careful, growth turns into accumulation. You keep layering new expectations on top of old ones. You adopt new identities without questioning whether the previous ones ever fit. After a while, it can feel heavy. You are not sure whether you are evolving or just collecting roles. And this is where the idea of peeling back the layers became important to me. Real change, at least in my experience, often happens when you start removing things instead of adding them. You let certain ambitions fade because they were never truly yours. You step away from routines that looked productive but left you disconnected. You question beliefs that once felt necessary but now feel restrictive. It's not about tearing your whole life down. It's more gentle than that. It's about noticing what feels forced and slowly releasing it. There's something powerful about subtraction. When you stop trying to redesign yourself and instead create space, the person underneath has room to breathe again. And usually that person isn't new. It's someone you already recognize from earlier years, from before you felt need to constantly optimize yourself. I've noticed that some of my clearest moments didn't come from adding another habit or chasing another goal. They came from simplifying, from letting certain pressures go quiet, from choosing not to fill every empty space with another improvement project. And that's where minimalism has played a surprisingly meaningful role for me. At first, it was just about physical things, fewer objects, less clutter, a calmer environment. But over time I realized it was doing something deeper. When there's less around you demanding attention, your mind becomes clearer. You can actually sense what brings peace and what creates tension. The noise fades just enough that you can hear your own thoughts again. Minimalism in that sense isn't about aesthetics. It's about clarity. It's about reducing external layers so internal signals become easier to recognize. And once you experience that clarity, it becomes harder to ignore your own truth. I really believe we all have some kind of inner compass. Not a dramatic voice telling you exactly what to do, but a subtle shift in how something feels. A lightness when you move in one direction, a quiet resistance when you move in another. The problem is that we often override it. We followed paths that socially approved. We pursue goals that sound impressive. We convince ourselves that if something looks good enough, it must be right. But your body and your mood tell a different story. You might notice that certain environments always leave you drained, no matter how logical they seem, or that you keep returning to the same idea, the same lifestyle, the same pace, even after trying to ignore it. Those patterns are not random, they are information. And the more you remove the layers that blur your perception, the need to impress, the fear of disappointing others, the constant comparison, the clearer that compass becomes. You don't need a perfectly mapped out future. You just need enough quiet to notice what feels honest, even slightly. There's also something important about how you to show up for yourself on a daily basis. Not when people are watching, not when you are performing, but when it's just you. The way you speak when you are tired, the choices you made when no one is validating them, the small decisions that align or don't with your values. Those tiny moments build your self-image. If you repeatedly act in ways that match what you believe in, even in small ways, you start trusting yourself. But sometimes you notice a gap. You react harsher than you meant to. You say yes when you wanted to say no. You brush off something that actually mattered to you. Those moments used to trigger self-criticism for me. But I've slowly learned the difference between honesty and self-attack. Honesty is calm. It simply says that didn't feel right. Self-criticism says, what's wrong with you? One leads to growth, the other leads to shame. If you are constantly punishing yourself for not being perfect, you'll stop looking inward altogether. But if you practice honest reflection without tearing yourself apart, something shifts. You become curious instead of defensive. And that curiosity changes everything. There's one more thing that become increasingly important to me. Learning to actually be with myself. We live in a time where it's very easy to avoid silence. You can fill every gap with scrolling, listening, consuming. But when was the last time you were simply alone with your thoughts for a while? Not distracted, not entertained, just present. For me, long walks without music have become a kind of quieter practice. No podcast in my ears, no background noise, just the sound of my steps, the air, whatever thoughts happen to surface. At first, it can feel restless. Your mind jumps around, you think about tasks, conversations, unfinished plans. But if you stay a little longer, something shifts. The noise settles, and underneath it there's a steadier voice. Sometimes it brings uncomfortable realizations. Sometimes it brings clarity you didn't expect. Either way, it builds familiarity. You begin to feel less afraid of your own mind. You stop abandoning yourself the moment something feels slightly uncomfortable. You learn to stay present with your experience instead of escaping it. And that staying creates trust. The more time you spend in your own company, the easier it becomes to recognize what aligns with you and what doesn't. When I think about the art of being yourself, I don't see it as a bold declaration of individuality. It's quieter than that. It's the willingness to question the life you are building before it becomes too rigid to change. It's the courage to remove what no longer fits. It's the patience to listen to subtle internal signals instead of chasing external approval. It's also the humility to admit that you are still learning who you are. Because being yourself isn't a fixed state. You are not uncovering one permanent identity and then holding onto it forever. You are in conversation with yourself over time. You change, your priorities shift, your pace evolves. And each time that happens, you are invited to peel back new layers. To ask again, does this still feel true? Does this direction still make sense for me? If the answer is no, it's not a failure, it's clarity. We are not here to perfectly execute someone else's definition of a good life. We are here to experience life as ourselves. That might look simple from the outside. It might not be particularly impressive. It might not follow the most efficient path. But if it feels aligned, if it feels steady and honest, that's enough. So, if you've been sensing that quiet question lately, don't rush to silence it. Just start noticing. Where do you feel at ease? Where do you feel tension? What can you gently let go of? Maybe the art of being yourself isn't about becoming more. Maybe it's about carrying less. Less expectation, less noise, less pretending, until what remains feels familiar. Until your life reflects not who you thought you had to be, but who you actually are. That, to me, is the real art of being yourself. That's all for today. I appreciate you being here and choosing to think a little deeper. If this video gave you something to reflect on, let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, stay free and unique on your journey to your personal true north.